So, following from Chris Knight's talk this morning, you'll know that he's proposed that we became human through a process that was both evolutionary and revolutionary. His model at the origins of symbolic culture uses standard Darwinian bodies of theory, focusing on female reproductive strategies in the latter stages of hominin evolution. And these strategies were designed to meet the costs of giving birth to and rearing larger-brained, more dependent offspring. This afternoon, I'll be focusing on some of the archaeologically testable, i.e. refutable, implications of his model, those concerning the evolution of collective ritual as the posited form of action by female-led coalitions to mobilize ever more reliable levels of male investment. In this subfield, the main predictions concerned the record of earth pigment use, predictions of form, quality, costs, and timing, together with predicted behavioral and species associations. Critically, they include a temporal prediction about a transition from quantitative to qualitative change, held to be revolutionary, falling at the end of our genetically and morphologically diagnosed African speciation around 170,000 years ago. The first part of my talk will address some background issues. What is red ochre? Distinguishing the formal characteristics of language and ritual, defining symbolic culture, outlining how archaeological debates about symbolic culture have changed over the last 30 years. Symbolic culture and ritual will be treated briefly here, as these have been covered by Chris earlier and in previous talks I believe he's given to you. The middle part of the talk reviews the brain size story during later hominin evolution, the associated archaeological behavioral record, and the predictions we were making a quarter of a century ago. And the last part focuses on how those predictions stand up to the vastly improved empirical record available now. First, red ochre. It's a loose term for any iron-rich rock or clay that can be powdered to produce a pigment by rubbing, grinding, or scraping. What makes the powder red is the iron oxide called hematite, literally blood-like stone. And I'm just going to switch to my, should be first slide. This is a grinding experiment I was doing in the Southern Cape with local ochres there, just to give you an idea of their form. Largely through weathering processes, ochres and hematites are widely available. Areas where they tend to be scarce are typically sand deserts and lowland tropical forests. There, people often replace earth pigments with plant dyes, generally leaving no archaeological trace. Ochre or hematite can be used for many things, some of which have nothing to do with its role as pigment, as a sunblock, a desiccant, or an abrasive, and plausibly as a functional ingredient in hafting mastics. More arguably, it's also proposed that ochre served as a hide preservative and even as an insect repellent. However, whether taken singly or together, these proposed prosaic uses can't provide a general explanation of the archaeological record. In particular, they can't explain the past selective criteria, which I investigated some years ago in the Middle Stone Age sequence of Blombos Cave on the southern coast of South Africa, spanning the period between about 100,000 and 70,000 years ago. This chart shows that redder pieces are more likely to be utilized. Here are the reddest at about 80%, and the least red down there. This one shows that it wasn't just redness that people were selecting for, but that across the range of pastel, intermediate, and saturated values, it was the combination of the reddest and most saturated values that were preferentially used. So here we go from grey at one extreme, pastel values, intermediate ones, then the very reddest intermediate values, and then moving into more saturated values. And we see the same pattern of grinding by, we see the same pattern of selection criteria operating among the more intensively ground pieces. So this is the unutilized sample moving through ground fragments, lightly ground, moderately ground, and intensively ground. And so these are the saturated and very reddest values up here, these three blocks. And these images give an idea of what those intensively ground pieces can look like. Honed points or crayons. Similarly, the various functional hypotheses don't begin to get to grips with the spatiotemporal features of the pigment record, and none of them are parsimonious, so I won't be addressing any of them in this talk. Ethnographically, among ochre-using cultures, the one invariant use is as a body paint or cosmetic. These may be applied for many different purposes, but among hunter-gatherer cultures in particular, it invariably includes ritual performance. And these images are from various Aboriginal cultures. There we go. This is a mortuary ritual in Northern Australia. And this last one is a late 19th century photograph where the initiates' costumes and the totemic design you see on the ground are made with blood and feathers. So they're using blood instead of red ochre here. Not that they don't have red ochre, but blood is even better. Archaeologically, it needs to be stressed at the outset that red ochre is the first recurrent category of artifact to appear alongside stone tools. Current evidence indicates that initial use began around 500,000 years ago, and until about 100,000 years ago, is the only repeatedly encountered category of evidence directly bearing on the evolution of communicative behaviors. Other kinds of earth pigment, such as black manganese and yellow ochre, scarcely get a look in until much later. Also, until around 100,000 years ago, we have no direct evidence as to what objects or surfaces pigments were being applied to. So, in common with most researchers, I start from the twin assumptions that in early contexts, ochre served primarily as an earth pigment and that its principal role was as a body paint or cosmetic. Some archaeologists make the further assumption that pigment use necessarily implies symbolic reference. While plausible, I won't be making this assumption here. Now, independent of Chris's model, for theoretical reasons that can be traced back to Durkheim, such skin-changing behavior is widely considered typical of group ritual performance. So here, this brings me to the diametrically opposed formal characteristics of language and collective ritual. The formal features of language include conventional code, cheap, digital, low amplitude signals, which allow for infinite creativity, interpersonal communication, and a focus on underlying intentions. Language, however, leaves no archaeological trace and has no clear evolutionary precedents. By contrast, the formal features of collective ritual include iconic and indexical signals that are costly to produce, analog, of high amplitude and high redundancy, group-on-group communication, and a focus on body boundaries and surfaces. It also tends to be periodic. For these reasons, it might be expected to leave a clear archaeological signature. It also has clear evolutionary precedents in the individual ritual displays seen in the rest of the animal world. Now, despite this apparent antithesis, Durkheim proposed that what he called the collective effervescence of group ritual provided the supportive framework for symbolic reference, including language, to become established. This supportive framework created the unprecedented levels of trust necessary for a cheap, coded form of communication to achieve evolutionary stability. It's worth noting, by the way, that in this context, Durkheim speculated that the earliest form of art would have been abstract designs on the body executed in red ochre. So what is symbolic culture? The easy bit is culture. Any set of socially learned and transmitted traditions, with the classic domain being technology, from chimpanzee termite probes and nut-cracking stones, through the full succession of hominin stone tool technologies, Aldebaran, Acheulean, Middle Stone Age, Upper Paleolithic, those kinds of things. Now, while chimpanzee cultural traditions tend to be localized, flaked stone traditions tend to be population-wide adaptations. And it's this material cultural record that archaeologists primarily had in mind from the late 19th century onwards, when they spoke about cultural evolution, a phrase that tended to drop out of use in the last quarter of the 20th century. Symbols, following Chris this morning, are radically different. They arise when we agree about something that doesn't exist. It exists only because we say it does. From a strictly empiricist perspective, they're collective deceptions, socially useful lies. So symbolic culture is the sum of those learned and transmitted, of those traditions learned and transmitted between generations through the invention of things that only exist in the symbolic realm, with language itself often considered the prime example. This, of course, is a paradox for the natural scientists. How can institutional facts, such as paper money, be treated like objective facts? This is one of the reasons why a satisfactory evolutionary account of symbolic culture has been so elusive. Now, as the last part of this introduction, I'll illustrate this problem by considering what's been dubbed the revolution that wasn't. When I began as a student of evolutionary anthropology and archaeology in the late 80s, mitochondrial genetic analyses had just established that women all over the world shared a last common African ancestress, roughly 200,000 years ago. Archaeologists had also just dated the earliest Homo sapiens fossils outside of Africa, at Shkul and Kafsa caves in Palestine, suggesting initial migration beyond Africa was around 100,000 years ago. Although some of these fossils were from burials with grave goods, most researchers believe that there was no compelling evidence for symbolic culture until about 40,000 years ago. The approximate date of the earliest beads, engravings, sculptures, and of course, cave painting. Most of this evidence came from Europe and associated with the biological replacement of Neanderthals by Homo sapiens and the cultural replacement of the Mousterian by the Upper Paleolithic. This huge temporal discrepancy from 200,000 to 40,000 suggested a cognitive Rubicon and led to widespread use of the term the human revolution. Apart from Chris Knight in his book Blood Relations, back in 1991, published shortly after the headlines about African mitochondrial Eve, nobody specified the content of this posited revolution, nor the material conditions responsible. Instead, the phrase was a convenient gloss for what was presumed to be the sudden appearance of language, attributed by some leading academics to a genetic macromutation in the hard wiring of the brain. Now, from an evolutionary perspective, this was clearly unsatisfactory, and most researchers were keen to restore Darwinian gradualism. Archaeologists, myself included, prioritized the search for earlier symbolic evidence in Africa, in the African Middle Stone Age, conventionally spanning the period from 300,000 to 40,000. Simplifying slightly, 20 years ago, such evidence began to emerge, with ochre painting kits, geometric engravings, shell beads, and symbolically elaborated burials, this one also including ochre in the grave fill. Consensual evidence for symbolic culture was pushed back to around 100,000 years. Although scarcely discussed, the only shared trait between these diverse discoveries was an association with red ochre, as a residue on some of the beads, as the substrate for the earliest engravings, and associated with some of the earliest burials. With these discoveries, all talk of the human revolution rapidly disappeared. 20 years on, however, following intensive research across much of Africa, it seems unlikely that these kinds of novel behaviors are going to be pushed back much further. In the meantime, our speciation has come to be understood as more protracted than originally suggested by mitochondrial Eve. The fossil evidence suggests a two-stage process, with a modern face first emerging around 320,000 years ago, and a modern brain case first appearing at 195,000. Genetically, genomic analyses suggest that the earliest divergence within our species occurred somewhere between 260 and 350,000. But mitochondrial analyses continue to point to a later date for the last common ancestress, with a best estimate at around 160,000. With this more protracted span, the temporal discrepancy between genetically and morphologically diagnosed speciation and consensual symbolic behavior remains substantial. Archaeologists have increasingly favored a demographic explanation, positing a threshold below which cultural innovations simply fail to stabilize. But perhaps the perceived discrepancy is attributable to a focus on innovation, on novel behaviors, rather than on quantifiable variation within traits, the focus of any strictly evolutionary research. And I'll develop this point when I come on to the pigment record. This is a slide of brain size increase over the last 3.5 million years. Having become a bipedal ape, the most distinctive feature of hominin evolution over the last 3 million years has been brain size increase. The selection pressures for larger brains are likely to have altered over time, but they essentially concern the cognitive demands of living in larger, more complex social groups. Now, large brains are very energetically expensive. In modern humans, they account for 20% of adult metabolic budgets, increasing to over 60% among children. Since early Homo, more than 2 million years ago, a large part of these costs were met through dietary shifts to higher quality foods, particularly increased reliance on animal fats and protein. What tends to get overlooked is that during pregnancy and lactation, the energetic costs of larger brains fall exclusively on mothers. Also, since early Homo, these costs would have been well beyond what a mother could meet through her own foraging effort. So the evolution of our genus has largely concerned two related lines of adaptation. On the one hand, how to procure greater quantities of energy-dense foods. On the other hand, strategies by which mothers could harness investment from others. On this score, most theorists believe that mothers initially turned to their own mothers, accounting for the evolution of menopause, where women live well beyond the span of their direct reproductive career, allowing them to help daughters rear at least one extra offspring. But modelers have also concluded that with Homo erectus from about 1.8 million years ago, in addition to their own foraging effort and that of older female kin, mothers also needed foraging effort from male mates. Now, following these early adaptations, in this period here, there's a long period of relative stasis in the brain size story. Wait a minute, sorry. I think I've to skip one here. This second graph focuses on the African record over the younger end of the time scale, the last 1.5 million years. So this is 1.5 million years ago, and this is almost present. It actually spans, it goes up to about 15,000 years ago, which I'll explain in a moment. The plot suggests 3 stepwise increases. So this lower band here. So this is the first increase. And this is actually a geological transition from the lower Pleistocene to the middle Pleistocene. A second increase just shortly before 350,000, and what looks like a final increase slightly less than 200,000 years ago. So these last 2 increases seem to correlate with our speciation. First a modern face, and then a modern cranial shape. What I mean by a modern cranial shape is this bottom slide here. This is called a globularized brain. Whereas this is one, well, the top one is a Neanderthal, and the middle one is an older African fossil cast from about 400,000. And this slide shows the raw data for the period from about 750 until 15,000 years ago. Essentially the middle Pleistocene, with a couple of upper Pleistocene specimens included to increase sample size at the younger end. The cut point of 15,000 is because globally, average brain size has declined in recent millennia, and that's tended to distort much of the discussion of the subject. The values are divided into 3 groups, with averages for each. Pre-Homo sapiens fossils in the Middle Pleistocene have an average cranial capacity just under 1,200 cubic centimeters. The early Homo sapiens, with a modern face but non-globular brain case, have an average of just under 1,400 cubic centimeters. The youngest group, with globular brain cases, have an average of 1,474. You can play around with some dates and cranial estimates a bit, but it's not going to alter the overall picture. Brain size increase clearly continued after 200,000. Given the sample size limitations, it seems that something close to maximum values had stabilized by around 150,000. An inference lent indirect support by the earliest non-African Homo sapiens fossils from Palestine, dating between 120 and 90,000, which provide a similar mean, similar average about 1480. The evolutionary significance of this is that evolving Homo sapiens mothers were presumably still under selection pressures to harness more reliable investment from males to meet increased maternal energy budget costs in this last period of brain size increase. This takes on added significance when placed in a climate context. The period from 195,000 to 130,000 represents the penultimate glacial cycle. Where we have African climate data within this span, they indicate fairly consistently dry conditions between 195 and 145,000. Now, in the strongly seasonal environments of African savannas and grasslands, dry seasons tend to be challenging. Not only are vegetable foods scarce, but game animals are very lean. So there's no fat or very little fat. You have to smash open all the bones and the brain case to get any fat at all. These problems would have been exacerbated between 195 and 145,000 years ago. So what does the archaeological record tell us about behavioral change over the broad span of Middle Pleistocene brain size increase? In the earlier Middle Pleistocene, things don't look very different from the Lower Pleistocene. Some hunting abilities are generally inferred, but there's virtually no evidence for the use of fire or of campsites. A major suite of changes begins around 500,000 years ago, although the timings differ between continents. In African stone tool technology, this is when blades and points begin to augment the million-year-old tradition of Acheulean hand axes. In southern Africa, this transitional industry, known as the foresmith, is associated with what have been interpreted as the earliest hafted stone points used for spears, although these are thought to have been primarily thrusting rather than thrown spears. In Europe and the Near East, from around 400,000, we begin to see specialized hunting of medium to large animals, sometimes targeting prime age adults, but also using collective drives and jump kills. At the same time, we see the earliest clear evidence for permanent campsites, with repeatedly used central hearths and abundant evidence for cooking. In the Near East, this coincides with a similar major technological shift to the foresmith. In Europe, this occurs slightly later, at around 300,000. The picture in Africa is currently less resolved for this period, but similar developments, probably beginning slightly earlier, can reasonably be inferred. Clearly, in the second half of the Middle Pleistocene, from around 400,000 years ago, the several hominin lineages occupying the Old World were significantly departing from earlier forms of social organization and subsistence strategy. The gradual emergence of a campsite-focused form of social organization with some logistical organizational capacities implied new levels of trust between group members and presumably, at least to some degree, a sex-based division of labor. But few, if any, archaeologists would countenance a claim for symbolic culture at this time depth. So this brings me to the female cosmetic coalitions or sex strike model, addressing both the evolution of group ritual and of symbolic culture. Chris's model, as amended by Camilla Power, is designed to address the maternal energy budget problems attendant upon subsequent brain size increase during the Middle Pleistocene. I think Camilla might be touching a bit upon this later on today, so I'll keep this brief, even at the expense of oversimplification and skipping important components. The essence of their argument is that females used the signaling potential of menstrual bleeding to manipulate group composition and male behavior. Males would be interested in menstruation as the only reliable indicator of fertility status among non-pregnant or breastfeeding females, with peak fertility occurring 2 weeks later. Females needing more reliable male provisioning couldn't allow males to discriminate between them on this basis, as it would result in male efforts being directed at females least in need of support. The hypothesis is that female coalitions acted to prevent any male targeting a menstruant at other females' expense by joining with her in sharing the blood, scrambling and amplifying the signal with blood substitutes like red ochre. Hey guys, look, we're all potentially fertile. You may think you know who genuinely is, but the only way you can get to her is on our terms. The menstruant provided a reliable signal of commitment to the coalition by doing without immediate favors from males, while all coalition members advertised the quality of their coalition through cosmetic display in a song and dance performance. In this way, females made it harder for a male to philander, going from one partner to the next, and rewarded those males prepared to invest. This is proposed as a two-stage process. Initially, these red ochre ritualized displays were put on only when there was a real menstruant. But as brain size continued to increase in the later Middle Pleistocene, and mothers needed more energy, they needed to organize these ritualized performances on a regular basis, regardless of whether any individual was actually menstruating. Effectively, this became a periodic sex strike, organized once a month, saying there'll be no sex until you come back with the bacon. In a reverse of standard sexual selection models, males prepared to invest would be the choosy sex, wanting reliable evidence that a child born into any particular coalition would have plenty of support. Otherwise, their efforts would be wasted. Different coalitions would be competing to put on the most impressive displays, advertising coalitionary quality. This would extend to procuring the best pigments, the reddest, most saturated, most brilliant, even if they came from far away. As with any sexual selection, this can readily become a runaway process, resulting in rapid evolutionary change. Blood becomes a symbolic construct, referring to temporary unavailability, sacredness or taboo, and fertility. By extension, an arch metaphor was created, equating women's blood with the blood of game animals when killed. At this point, we're clearly really in the domain of symbolic culture. When the model was first proposed 25 years ago, we made the following predictions. Initial use of ochre shouldn't predate the onset of Middle Pleistocene brain size increase, which was then placed at 500,000 years ago. A selective focus on red rather than white, black, or yellow. Initially, exclusively local raw materials should be used. A shift from irregular to regular use by the time modern brain size had stabilized. As a runaway process of sexual selection, this should be an abrupt rather than a gradual change. And finally, the competitive dynamic between female coalitions should result in A, pronounced selective bias for the reddest and most saturated raw materials, and B, where these were locally unavailable, considerable costs should be incurred to procure them. On the shift to regular use, although we lacked good data on when modern brain size stabilized back in the mid-90s, on partially independent grounds concerning global climate constraints, we dared to be quite precise. A shift from irregular to regular and ubiquitous use of red ochre hematite in campsites should be evident by the peak of the penultimate glacial between 160 and 140,000 years ago. Right, so we're now finally in a position to start reviewing the Earth pigment record and how it aligns with these predictions. Now, although I said, sorry, let's just get rid of this. Although I said the African archaeological record is poorly resolved regarding the emergence of campsites, on one topic, it is uniquely informative concerning the evolution of collective ritual. This is a map of the Northern Cape on the southern fringes of the Kalahari Basin, showing the distribution of some forest smith sites. The ones I'll be talking about, Katupan, Vanderwerk, and Canteen Copy. The earliest dating estimate we have is from Katupan at around 500,000. This was the site where the stone points were interpreted as spear armatures. Of arguably greater significance, it's provided the earliest evidence for pigment use anywhere in the world. These are mostly scraped, the top is scraped specularite with another piece in the top right. Slightly less specular expression in the bottom left, which has been ground rather than scraped. And these are two pieces of ordinary hematite. Specularite is simply a glittery expression of hematite. The beauty of these first occurrences is that they leave us in little doubt. Hang on. Sorry, they leave us in little doubt as to the principal domain of use. In ethno-historical records from around the world, specularite was only used for its glittery appearance. Depending on local variations and how it's processed, it provides a very dark red streak and is frequently mixed with non-specular forms of hematite to enhance the redness. When Europeans first arrived in the Northern Cape, they reported it being traded or directly procured over vast distances, up to 500 kilometers. This image illustrates the powder and streak of pieces from several forest smith sites in the region. While Katupan is the earliest dated occurrence, the pigments from the presently undated forest smith occupations from Vanderwerk Cave provide a unique insight. This is a photo, what you see from the back of the cave. The white light at the far end is the entrance. The occupations at the front of the cave go back over 1 million years and provide the earliest compelling evidence for use of fire. As at Catupan and Canteen Copy, there are no pigments associated with these Acheulean occupations. The cave stretches back into the hillside for about 140 meters, and at the back, the earliest hominin activity associates with the forest myth. It's so dark here that it can only be used with firelight. It's from these levels that the earliest pieces of specularite, hematite, and red ochre were recovered, providing compelling indirect evidence for firelit, brilliant ritual display. Another crucial piece of evidence concerns the likely procurement of these pigments. Catupan is just 11 kilometers from a massive natural outcropping of specularite. But at Wonderwerk, the nearest source of either specularite or hematite is about 45 kilometers away, with no natural drainage that could bring the material closer. At Canteen Copy, down on the Vaal River, where the forest myth is dated at more than 300,000, the situation's more extreme. The closest outcrop seems to be 170 kilometers. The outcroppings are marked by these horizontal lines here. With again, no indication that they could be naturally transported. So at least by the later forest myth, it seems that people, were prepared to incur high costs in terms of raw material procurement to put on their brilliant ritual displays. Now, this regional cluster of earliest pigment occurrences is shortly followed by isolated occurrences at around 320,000 from Oligocele in East Africa, at around 400,000 at Terra Amata in Europe, and greater than 300,000 at Bekoff in India. So we're dealing with a novel behavior, an innovation apparently shared by several different hominin lineages, which suggests a common response to a shared problem. Theoretical considerations would suggest group ritual, while the foregoing archaeological background suggests that the context for all these early occurrences was establishing the requisite levels of trust for a campsite form of social organization to stabilize. Be this as it may, the pigment records between continents, and thus between hominin lineages, dramatically diverge after about 300,000. The Indian occurrence seems to be an isolate. In Europe, after Terra Amata, there are a few occurrences between 200 and 240,000 years ago, and then a pronounced find gap. In Africa, by contrast, from around 300,000, the record begins to pick up in both eastern and southern parts of the continent, with about 3 times as many pigment-associated sites as in the whole of Middle Pleistocene Europe. Now, before reviewing this part of the record, it's important to bear in mind that while hominin populations within Africa were probably always greater than beyond the continent, the number of excavated Middle Stone Age sites remains much smaller than Mousterian counterparts in Europe and Western Asia, notwithstanding intensive African research over the last 20 years. The first thing to say is that the African Middle Stone Age research largely remains a story of 2 regions, Eastern and Southern Africa. A growing body of research is now available for Mediterranean North Africa, but very little is known about Central and Western Africa. The Southern African record largely comprises rock shelter and cave sequences dated to the Upper Pleistocene, that is, younger than about 125,000. Such sites can fairly safely be assumed to have served as campsites. Notwithstanding an outdated Middle Stone Age systematics and a very limited chronometric dating, 20 years ago, I was essentially able to show that ochre use was regular and ubiquitous to these sites, constituting a continuous tradition from at least 110,000 years ago into the ethnographic present. For all cultural substages, from what here I've designated MSA2B, it was present in more than 80% of excavation aggregates. This is a sample based on about 70 different sites and many more actual excavation aggregates. So I interpreted this as early evidence for symbolic culture in Africa prior to or around the time of initial migrations beyond the continent. This was when most archaeologists were still assuming a cognitive Rubicon at 40,000, with this decidedly Eurocentric bias. Very few Southern African sites have been dated to the Middle Pleistocene portion of the Middle Stone Age, that is, older than 130,000. The East African record differs for two basic reasons. First, widespread Rift Valley volcanics meant that reliable dating, going much further back than was possible until recently in Southern Africa, has been available for about 50 years. Second, landscape geology is quite different, providing fewer rock shelters. Most excavated sites have come from open contexts, typically making it much harder to infer which sites served as campsites. So, we've had an earlier record from Eastern Africa, informative about technotopological changes associating with our speciation, but a relatively poor record from both regions regarding behavioral change at the crucial locus of campsites. As I'll come on to shortly, this is beginning to improve, but even as things stand, a mosaic picture emerges about pigment use in the early Middle Stone Age, between approximately 320 and 200,000 years ago. At some sites, it's absent. At others, it's an irregular or infrequent occurrence. And a few show regular use. Of the latter, reasonably well-documented cases are the collapsed cave of Twin Rivers in Zambia from around 260,000, and a Apollo 11 rock shelter in southern Namibia from around 237,000. In both cases, the pigments are thought to have come from the local environment. At Apollo 11, from immediately in front of the shelter. So, taking pigment use as a proxy of collective ritual, in this critical respect, during our speciation, our lineage was already diverging quite dramatically from ancestral Neanderthals and the little-known Denisovians. The last part of the story concerns a long-neglected Middle Stone Age variant called the Petersburg, primarily known from northeastern South Africa and Eswatini, Swaziland. In the mid-20th century, it was the best-known MSA industry on the continent and provided the most compelling case for cultural evolution at a regional scale. This was largely through the work of Revel Mason. Unlike all other claims for cultural evolution within the Middle Stone Age, this extended beyond the traditional realm of stone tool technology and typology. In 1945, the original Petersburg type sequence of Border Cave had provided an infant burial accompanied by a seashell pendant, subsequently shown to bear ochre residues and dated to 77,000. Now this wasn't accepted for the best part of 60 years. This burial came from the very end of the Petersburg. In the late 50s, Mason undertook the first multi-site quantitative analysis of the Middle Stone Age, identifying a serial trend within the Petersburg, comprising half a dozen traits. one of which was the appearance of pigment and grindstones within the course of the Petersburg. Having unfortunately excluded Border Cave from his analysis, this aspect of his findings was based on just 3 sites. The key site was Cave of Hearths, where pigment was absent in the early and middle phases of the industry, present in the developed phase. Mulu's cave represented the middle and developed phases, with pigment rare in the former and common in the latter. Olibumport was a single phase occupation, having lithic traits intermediate between the middle and developed phases. Here, pigments were superabundant, with over 12 kilograms excavated. We now know that this wasn't an innovation, but I'll show that Mason had identified a significant quantitative change. Hang on a minute. This is the view from Border Cave. After Mason's work, only one other Petersburg analysis was forthcoming, following Beaumont's re-excavations of Border Cave in the 1970s. Beaumont's analysis seemed to significantly qualify the lithic aspects of Mason's findings, and he provided, and no quantitative data on the pigments was published. Together with poor dating prospects and growing disenchantment with the idea of cultural evolution as an explanatory paradigm, attention just switched to other regions, and Mason's serial trend was largely forgotten. Beaumont went back to the site in the 80s to resolve the Petersburg stratigraphy and get dating samples for newly available techniques, which eventually showed that the sequence goes back approximately 250,000 years, suggesting that the older Petersburg aggregates at Cave of Hearths go back about 300,000 to the beginning of the Middle Stone Age. However, ostensibly because the 70s analysis was considered adequate, despite being based on semi-arbitrary excavation aggregates that came from 2 separate trenches, which were treated as a continuous sequence, the material from the 1980s was never analysed, and that remains the case, apart from myself who's looked at the pigments. I'm not a lithic specialist. But I have been able to re-evaluate Beaumont's work in the 70s and show how he messed up the 70s stratigraphy and over-reduced his primary data categories. That's why his findings challenged Mason's serial trend and the original 1945 site report. When reconfigured in the light of the largely dated 80s stratigraphy, they corroborate Mason in all essential respects, crucially including the pigment record, which is the only archaeological data that we have from the 80s excavation. This chart shows the relative frequencies of pigment measured as a percentage of the total lithic pigment assemblages for all 5 Petersburg members. As noted, the basal assemblage is thought to be in the order of 250,000 years old, while the overlying member provided dating estimates of 227 and 184,000. In both members, pigments were so rare as to be on the edge of archaeological visibility. It's only because of the large size of the assemblages that their presence could be established. The overlying member, 5th brown sand, has inverted dating estimates of 144 and 161,000, placing it squarely within the penultimate glacial of marine isotope stage 6. This sees a massive increase in both the absolute and relative frequencies of pigments to levels that are maintained for the rest of the Petersburg. This is the sole piece that was found from Beaumont's 80s excavations in the lowermost layer. And it's a piece of fairly pure hematite. And you can see where it's been abraded here, showing the redness. This is a piece, the only piece encountered from the lowest level of his 1970s excavation. I hope you can see the slightly specular nature of this otherwise quite weathered hematite, slightly glittery, the white flecks. And this is a piece of ore grade hematite from the next layer up that provided the dates of around 227,000. It was one of only 3 pieces found in this layer. Now, the local geology for tens of kilometers in all directions around Border Cave consists of basalt and rhyolite lavas, not known to produce relatively pure forms of hematite. However, 130 kilometers to the northwest, there is the oldest mine in the world, the Specular hematite mine of Lion Cavern. This was Beaumont excavating there in the 1960s. It isn't reliably dated because they only had radiocarbon dating at the time, but it's known to be older than 50,000 years old. And this is a sample of the raw material from Lion Cavern. Here it is again, in comparison to the basal piece from Beaumont's 1970s excavation from the deposits on bedrock. I think you'll agree that there is quite a good resemblance, and which suggests that around 250,000 years ago, during our speciation, people were prepared to go to great lengths to procure the highest quality pigments, much like their ethnographic counterparts from the Northern Cape, and also in Central Australia, where Aboriginals would undertake ochre procurement expeditions of, again, around 500 kilometers. Now, a few weeks ago, a date was published from Oliboomport, one of Mason's original Petersburg sites, the one with huge quantities of pigment. The single Petersburg aggregate provided an estimate of around 150,000, comparable to the dates from 5th Brown Sand at Border Cave, the member in which pigment use suddenly became regular. Another Petersburg site is Bushman's Rock Shelter, currently being re-excavated. The original excavation provided a 7-meter sequence of 107 layers. Everything below layer 17 was designated Middle Stone Age. And here I'm just showing relative pigment frequencies from the bottom of the sequence up to about layer 27. And I've argued that regular use can be inferred from layer 31 upwards. In the original excavations in the 70s, on geomorphological grounds, a long hiatus was inferred between layers 31 and 30, with it tentatively being inferred that layer 31 was Middle Pleistocene, i.e. older than 130,000. I'm eagerly awaiting the findings from the new excavations to learn if this inference was correct, and if so, how much older than 130,000 layer 31 proves to be. The Petersburg's important because it currently represents the only regional cluster of campsites spanning our speciation. Cave of Halves, Border Cave, Mooloo's Cave, and Bushman's Rock Shelter all show a similar pattern, with either no pigment or very infrequent pigment in the oldest layers, then becoming regular, and remaining so thereafter. This shift has only been dated at Border Cave, but it's precisely when we predicted 25 years ago. We should get new dates from Border Cave soon, from the current excavations. And I expect that the dates from Fifth Brown Sand, the one that has currently got dates of 140 and 160,000, will be pushed back a bit, closer to 180,000. 20 years ago, I could only confidently infer regular and ubiquitous use of red ochre in southern African campsites from around 110,000. Today, just about all dated assemblages up to 170,000 show this pattern. Older than this, the picture becomes much more of a mosaic, resembling the continent-wide picture between 200 and 500,000 years ago. Even without the female cosmetic coalitions model, this might be considered a case of incremental quantitative change over the previous 300,000 years, becoming a qualitative change at the very end of our speciation. But when we have such a pattern being theoretically predicted before the data was in, we can be confident that we're dealing with a change from quantity to quality, like the freezing and boiling points of water. Of course, I can't prove that the archaeological ochre record had in the past anything like the signification we're proposing, but I don't need to. First, the source model is proving more productive than anything else available. Second, it generates an underlying syntax to the mobilization of ritual power that is remarkably precise and testable against the details of the ethnographic record of myth and ritual. If I had time, I could also address the model's other archaeological predictions regarding the precise form of male labor being mobilized by female coalition reaction, periodic collective big game hunting, with the periodicity predicted to be lunar, with hunts around full moon. But that's another talk. Returning to the red flag of prehistory, as some of our ancestors dispersed out of Africa from about 120,000 years ago, red ochre use is a hallmark of that dispersal. In the Levant, it's present in the two burial sites of Shkul and Kafsa caves, dating between 120 and 90,000. In India, after that initial occurrence of red ochre at greater than 300,000, the next occurrence is in the order of 75,000 years ago, thought to associate with our dispersal into Southeast Asia. Ground specularite and hematite associate with the oldest occupation of Australia at Malukananja shelter, dated at 52,000. One of the hallmarks of the European Upper Paleolithic from 40,000 years ago is copious use of red ochre, supported by pigment mines like this one in the Northern Aegean, dated at 20,000. One of the oldest dated sites in the Americas is a recently discovered flooded mine in the flooded ochre mine in the Yucatan Peninsula, dated at just over 21,000. So, in conclusion, the mainstream view is that our speciation presents a paradox, with a major temporal discrepancy between genetically and morphologically diagnosed speciation and symbolic culture as our most distinctive cognitive and behavioral attribute. Contrary to this view, I've argued that our speciation appears entirely conventional in evolutionary terms, comprising a suite of genetic, morphological, and behavioral changes. The defining behavioral change is that group ritual using red body paints or cosmetics became a matter of habitual performance, and that this happened relatively rapidly. This permits the more abstract inference that symbolic culture involving some kind of blood symbolism had become an evolutionary stable strategy. across vast landscapes, people were able to refer to shared fictions and treat them as objective facts, similar to the gods, dragons, and rainbow snakes we're familiar with in anthropology. So our speciation, while gradual and conventional on the one hand, was also revolutionary in its final stages, both in tempo and finally stabilizing a new kind of information and information transmission. Thank you.